It began with a single used-up shoe. Most folks would never have even noticed it. Scuffed, torn, faded by time, but for this one stray dog, it was everything. He wouldn't let go, no matter how many people attempted to steal it, as if it were tattered and completely useless. He clutched it as if it were all that remained in the world. Story comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. And when someone eventually figured out that reason, it broke everybody's heart. There were always stray dogs in that small town. Many of them roamed from place to place, hunting for scraps, evading humans, just existing. But this dog, he was different, because he never left. Day after day, he perched in the same place at the side of an old dirt road, through the boiling summer heat, through the crystal winter nights. He waited, and at his feet at all times was the shoe. He was, it's believed, waiting for its owner to come back. Others thought he was just another stray, too lost or too frightened to leave. But no one knew the truth. Not yet. And when they finally found out what he was really waiting for, the whole town would never be the same again. For weeks, the townspeople paid him no mind. They had their own lives to think about, their own problems. But one day, someone hit the brakes, a woman named Lena. She had seen the dog before. She had passed him more times than she could count, but today, something seemed different. But the way he was looking at her, like he was pleading, like a man begging someone, anyone, to get it. So she parked her car, stepped out, and walked toward him. That's when she spotted the shoe, how he cradled it between his paws, the way he gripped it for dear life. Lena knelt beside him, softly, carefully. She reached for the shoe, and the dog let out a gut-wrenching whimper, as if she had simply touched a piece of his soul. And in that moment, Lena knew this was no ordinary dog, and that shoe held a tale no one was prepared to hear. Lena tried to take it, gently, slowly, but the dog wouldn't let go. His eyes went wide with desperation, with fear, and that's when she realized this was more than a possession. It was a memory, a promise, a secret of vows to finally be discovered. And before this night ended, Lena was about to learn precisely what it was, and it would break her heart. Lena hesitated. The dog clung tight to the worn-out, ragged shoe. His body curled around it, as if protecting something precious, something irreplaceable. His eyes, bottomless wells of longing, locked with hers, as if to say, "Please don't take it away." Lena swallowed hard. She wasn't here to hurt him. All she wanted was to learn more, because this wasn't normal. No, dogs didn't just snap and cling to old shoes as if their lives depended on it. Unless it wasn't any old shoe, unless it was something more. It was something that still had significance. Lena dug through her bag, then withdrew a half-eaten sandwich. She'd picked it up earlier, but never finished it. She ripped a small piece off and offered it to him. The dog's nostrils quivered, his frame going rigid. He was hungry. That much was clear. But still he would not part with the shoe. Lena sighed. This wasn't going to be easy, but she had made up her mind. She wasn't going anywhere until she learned why this shoe was so important. She slowly reached out again, not to steal it, just to stroke it. The dog flinched, and for the first time, Lena saw something different, a detail so small it made her shiver. Inside the shoe was something written, faint, almost faded. But it was there. Lena's heart raced. She had to see it. She carefully twisted the shoe just enough to glimpse what was inside. And there, written in childlike handwriting, was a name that delivered a shockwave through her body. Ethan! Her throat went dry. She had heard that name before. It was in the news. A tale that had long terrified the town. A boy who had gone missing 5 years ago. Lena's hands began to shake. She looked down at the dog, his body squished further up against the shoe, as though it were the only thing keeping Ethan's memory alive. Her stomach knotted. Could it be? Could that dog have been waiting for a boy who never returned? Had he spent all those years sitting in this chair, protecting this one small piece of him? Lena's eyes stung with tears. This wasn't just a dog. This was a guardian, a protector, a faithful friend who never lost faith. And now, Lena was finally going to find out what happened to Ethan, and why this dog did not want to move on. Lena's hands shook as she looked down at the faded name in the shoe. Ethan. Her mind raced. She remembered the story now. It had been 5 years since the disappearance of a young boy named Ethan. Weeks had gone by, the town looking, posters and news reports, search parties in the woods, but no one ever found him. Over time, the case had gone cold. Now she was here, confronting a dog that had been standing guard over this lone sneaker, a shoe that had Ethan's name written inside it. Her heart raced in her ears. It could not have been a coincidence. The dog gave a gentle whimper, its eyes still on her, waiting, watching, as if he needed her to know. Lena swallowed hard. What was she supposed to do now? Flipping her phone out, she typed "Ethan missing case" into the browser bar. Articles popped up on her screen, and there it was. His face. A boy with tousled blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a wide, toothy smile. It was 5 years old, but just the sight of it set a lump in Lena's throat. She glanced back at the dog, her heart pounding. This wasn't just any stray. This was Ethan's dog. He had been waiting all these years, waiting for his boy to return home. There was a heavy pain in Lena's chest. This dog never left. He had waited on the side of this road through rain, through snow, through blistering heat, protecting the last thing he had left of Ethan. There were tears stinging at the corners of her eyes. Lena took a deep breath. She couldn't just walk away. The dog had waited 5 long years. All anyone had to do was tell him the truth at last. But just as she was reaching to grab the phone to call someone, anyone to report what she had found, something caught her eye. There, just past the trees, the dense overgrowth appeared, disturbed, like something, or someone, had recently been there. Her skin prickled. Everyone had thought Ethan's case was cold for 5 years, that there was no more to discover. But this was a dog that never quit. Had he been trying all along to guide someone somewhere? Lena's stomach tightened. What if finally she was the first person to listen? The dog turned and began to look toward the trees. Then he stood up. As he had done on so many other visits, he left the shoe behind except this time, and without a moment's pause, he began to walk. Lena followed. Because whatever had come out there, he needed her to see it. And she knew deep down, she was about to discover something no one was prepared for. Lena stopped only a moment, then stepped forward, doing as the dog did, stepping into the deep tree line. Here, the air tasted differently, heavy, ripe with something unuttered. Boyd's Magnus. The name still worked like an incantation, and the deeper they walked, the quieter the world seemed. The trees themselves seemed like a held breath. The dog trudged towards the door, slow but purposeful. His nose brushed the ground, his tail lowered, every part of him tense, with a feeling that Lena couldn't quite identify. Was it anticipation? Fear? The shoe remained abandoned by the roadside, but the dog no longer appeared to be worried about it, as if he knew Lena had finally begun to get it. Twigs broke under her feet as she followed him farther in. The undergrowth thickened, writhing like clutching fingers around the floor of the forest. There was a cold prickling at her skin. She should have been afraid. She should have turned back. But something about the way this dog moved, the quiet urgency of his steps, pushed her forward. Then he stopped. He stiffened, ears forward, body tense. And then he whined. A sound so low and so mournful that Lena felt it pierce straight to her heart. She moved forward, her breath shallow, and then she saw it. The dirt was a small, unnatural mound. The ground was uneven, the earth lightly disturbed, as if something had been buried there. Lena's pulse pounded. Number no, no, no. The idea forming in her brain was pushing back. This surely couldn't be what she thought it was. She faced the dog, voice almost a whisper. What? What is this? The dog didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. He just stood there, staring at that mound of earth as if it had all the answers he'd been looking for. Lena swallowed hard, then knelt. She flinched as she brushed away the loose dirt. Moist dirt clung to her fingertips. Then her fingers touched something solid, something wooden. Her breath hitched. A box. It was tiny, no larger than a shoebox. The surface was rough, rotting, bleached from years of the sun. Lena's stomach twisted. Her hands quavered. She dug deeper, extracting the box from the earth. It was lighter than I thought it would be. The dog sat next to her now, his body pressed against hers, his breath hot and rhythmic against her arm, as if to say, "You're the only person here who was willing to listen." Her chest tightened. She slowly lifted the lid, and inside, Lena gasped. Her entire body went numb, because staring back at her was a photograph of Ethan, and a handwritten note, a note that would alter everything. Lena could barely breathe as she stared down at what was inside the wooden box. It was weathered and curled at the edges, but the face within was unmistakable. Ethan. In the grainy picture, his bright blue eyes shone, a toothy grin stalemated. In the photo, he couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. He had seemed so alive, so full of joy. But it was the message under the photo that sent an icy shiver down Lena's spine. The ink had faded a little bit over the years, but the words were still readable. "Please don't forget me." Lena's stomach twisted. The handwriting was scrawled, childish, the letters uneven, as if they'd been jotted down in a hurry. Those words carried almost a hint of desperation. The dog emitted a faint whimper as he nuzzled against her side. He was shaking. Lena swallowed hard and focused on taking deep, measured breaths. This wasn't just some old shoe. This was not a wayward dog stuck in the past. This was a message. It was a message left here for someone to find. She glanced down at the dog, at the way his eyes never strayed from the photograph. His body shuddered, but he didn't pull back. Had he been waiting for someone, anyone, to see this? Had he sat by the road, day after day, guarding this box because he knew the truth? Lena curled her hands into fists. If this was Ethan's box, where was Ethan? She scanned the room, and something went on in her body that felt like every nerve switch in her body had turned on at once. A pulse thumping through her, a buzz beneath her skin. It was darker in the woods now, the silence low. She had arrived here, believing she just encountered a hookish stray dog attached to a shoe. But now she knew better. She was standing in the middle of an unsolved mystery that had lain buried for 5 years. And there was one thing that would reveal the truth. Lena inhaled deeply and picked up her phone. She needed to reach out to someone, the police, the press, anyone who would listen. But before she could dial, the dog's ears perked up. His body tensed. Then before she could react, he took off, a flash of fur slipping into the trees. Lena's heart pounded against her ribs. "Wait!" she cried, stuffing the photograph and note into her pocket as she fell to her feet. Her brain was yelling at her to stop. She didn't even know where he was heading, but somewhere beneath, she knew this wasn't over, not yet. And if she wanted answers, she had no other choice but to follow him. Lena's feet slapped the musty forest floor as she ran after the dog. She pressed on, heart pounding as the wind shrieked through the trees and contorted the branches into ghostly forms. The dog moved quickly, its lean body coursing through the undergrowth with terrifying accuracy. Lena struggled to keep up. Her breath came as sharp pants, her thighs burning with each step. But she didn't slow down. She couldn't. The dog wasn't just running, he was leading her somewhere. The realization sent a shiver racing down her spine. For 5 years, this dog had waited, sitting right where it was, refusing to leave. He had guarded that shoe as if it were the last piece he had left of his missing boy. And now he was moving. And that could only mean one thing. They were close. Branches scratched at her arms as she ran. As they went deeper, the head of the woods seemed to shift. The air thickened, laden with something she couldn't quite identify. Then, out of nowhere, the dog stopped, dead in his tracks. Lena skidded to a stop behind him, almost landing on her knees. She could hardly catch her breath, her pulse thrumming in her ears. But none of that mattered now, because she saw it too. In the middle of a clearing was a small, abandoned cabin. Its walls were warped with age, the windows black, the roof half collapsed from decades of neglect. Vines crept up its flanks and swallowed it whole. It seemed like time had forgotten it. Yet, something about it struck her as wrong. Lena's skin prickled. The dog stood frozen next to her, his eyes riveted to the door. And for the first time since she had encountered him, he growled, a deep, guttural sound that stood every hair on the back of her neck on end. Lena swallowed, her fingers squeezing her phone. She should call someone. She should go back and get help. But her feet wouldn't move. There was something important about this place. This dog whom she had spent all this time following, whom she had trusted. And now he had come and brought her here. Her throat went dry. She took a step forward, slowly. The porch creaked under her weight, but no one came. The air was redolent with damp wood and must, and the dog stayed close, his growl never wavering. Lena grabbed the rusted doorknob, her fingers wet with sweat. She twisted. The door swung open. They're devoured entirely by the darkness within. And as Lena crossed over the threshold, she just knew, whatever it was that had happened to Ethan, the truth was in this house waiting for her. Lena paused outside the door of the rotting cabin. It was a thick, unnatural stillness, bearing down on her chest like a weight. Only the faint light of the forest penetrated the interior, the inside hidden in pools of dim light. The dog was beside her, his body tight, ears at full mast, nose flicking the air. He was on high alert, and that terrified her. All along, he had been cautious, sad even. But now he was afraid. Lena swallowed hard. She had to go inside. With a tentative breath, she stepped onto the decaying floorboards. They creaked beneath her weight. The dog trailed behind, his nails clicking softly on the wood. She could smell mold and dampness and something faintly metallic. Her pulse hammered. An old wooden table sat to her left, thick with dust. To her right, a fireplace, long unused, its bricks stained with age. The air was still, too still. She took a slow breath in and let it out. The dog then emitted a low whimper. Her breath hitched. He wasn't staring at the walls. He wasn't gazing at the floor. He was gazing at another thing. Lena followed his gaze, and her stomach dropped. A trapdoor was in the middle of the cabin. Its edges were only faintly visible through a layer of dirt and littered debris. But now that she had seen it, she couldn't unsee it. A trapdoor, going somewhere under the house. The dog took a tentative step forward and let out another whine. Lena felt the earth fall away as she reached out and cleared some dirt, exposing a rusting metal handle. She swallowed. Was she going to go through with it? Her body was shouting at her to turn back, to leave, to get help. But deep down, something inside her said, "This is why you're here. This is what he wanted you all to find." Lena braced herself, and then, with a deep breath, she pulled. The trapdoor creaked, the hinges squealing, with dust swirling into the air. Nothing but darkness stretched below her, yawning into the unknown. A thin wooden staircase dropped down, fading into the darkness. The air that wafted upwards from below was stale, cold, wrong. Her hands balled into fists. Something was down there, something buried for a long time. She glanced at the dog. His eyes were glued to the opening. He wasn't barking, he wasn't growling, but he was waiting. Lena took a step forward, then another. The stairs groaned under her weight and swallowed her whole in the darkness. Or, as she neared the bottom, she discovered she was not alone. Lena's breath caught in her throat as her foot landed on the last step. Dust shrouded the air, the smell of rot permeating the frigid subterranean chamber. A chill flew up her spine, and goosebumps exploded over her skin as her eyes found the trickle of light pouring in from the open trapdoor above her. The dog followed her cautiously, his breath coming fast and shallow, his tail low, but ears at the ready. He had not simply been afraid, he had been expecting something. Lena willed herself to step forward again. Her fingers grazed against the wet rocks, tracing the ridges left by time-worn bricks, frigid and indifferent under her touch. It was a small, narrow, claustrophobic space. She took a deep breath, calming her nerves. The basement was supposed to be empty, and yet it wasn't. She could see shapes in the low light, shadowy figures piled up against the walls. Lena's pulse pounded. Finally, she grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight to pierce through the dark. Her stomach flipped at the instant the beam struck the far end of the room. Wooden crates, dozens of them piled up neatly, some older and rotten, some newer, unfettered by time. She swallowed hard. This wasn't some abandoned house. Someone had been here. The dog made a low, nervous whimper, his nose flicking as he took an uneasy step toward the crates. Lena hesitated. Something inside her cried, "Don't open them!" But she had already traveled so far. Bending down, she knocked off the dust that was on the top of the closest box. It wasn't locked, only held with rusted nails. Her fingers sank into the wood, prying it with a soft creak. It made her gasp what she saw inside. Old clothes, children's clothes, minuscule shirts, shoes, and jackets, folded, unblemished by time. Lena's fingers shook as she dipped inside, emerging with a tiny gray sweater. She knew. This sweater. It was the same one Ethan wore in his final missing persons photo. Her heart stopped. She dropped the fabric as if it had scalded her, stepping back dazed while her mind struggled to comprehend what she was seeing. These weren't just arbitrary crates. These were belongings, personal items of children who went missing. The realization made her blood run cold. She wasn't meant to be here. Whoever had been preserving these things, they had wanted them to remain in the dark. She needed to leave. Now, Lena spun, struggling to catch her breath. She had to go back up the stairs, leave this house, call someone. Then she heard it. A noise, faint, muffled, coming from farther inside the basement. Lena froze. It wasn't the house settling, it wasn't the wind. It was a noise she recognized. A sound that chilled her to the bone. Crying. A child's crying, somewhere in the dark. Someone was still down here. Lena's chest tightened as the sound of soft, broken sobs echoed through the basement. It wasn't her imagination. It wasn't the wind. Someone, a child, was down here. The dog beside her let out a low, anxious whimper, his body tense as his ears flicked toward the farthest corner of the room. He knew too. Lena swallowed hard, gripping her phone tighter as she slowly lifted the flashlight. The beam of light wavered, her fingers trembling as she scanned the room. She barely dared to breathe. The crates, the dust-covered walls, the exposed wooden beams all stood motionless in the still air. But when she moved the light just a little further, she saw it. A small door, barely big enough for an adult to crawl through. It was set low into the brick wall, its edges uneven, the wood chipped and stained, and from behind it, the crying grew louder. Lena's stomach twisted. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to run. But how could she? She couldn't just walk away, not now. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, the dog staying close by her side. Her hand reached out, hovering inches above the rough surface of the door. It was cold. She didn't even have to try the handle to know it was locked. A quiet curse left her lips. "Hello?" she called out, her voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. The crying stopped. Lena's pulse pounded in her ears. Then, a voice, small, weak, terrified. "Help, please." Lena's heart shattered. It was a child, a real child, trapped behind this door. She had to get them out. Frantically, she searched for something, anything to break through. The crates, the old rusted pipes along the wall. There had to be a way. The dog let out a sudden bark, sharp and urgent, stepping closer to the door, his nose pressed against the gap at the bottom. Then, for the first time, she heard something else, something above them. A sound she hadn't noticed before. Footsteps. Her blood turned to ice. Someone was in the house. Someone who shouldn't be there. And worse, they were coming downstairs. A floorboard creaked above her head. The hair on her arms stood on end. Lena held her breath, her entire body frozen as the realization sank in. She had thought she was alone down here. She wasn't. And now, she had to act fast. Lena gasped in short, shallow breaths as the footsteps above intensified. Whoever was at home, they weren't in a hurry. The steps were slow, deliberate, testing the old wooden floors with a creepy sort of patience. They knew they weren't alone. Lena balled her fists and made herself think. The door. That child was stuck behind that door. The dog's whole body went rigid, and he issued a low, fearful growl, his ears pricking toward the trapdoor above. Lena looked back, and her escape route remained clear. She could leave. She could run. But if she did, she would be leaving the child behind. The thought sickened her, and her hands flew, snatching up the closest crate and flipping it over. The old wood broke apart, but inside, tools, rusted pliers, a bent wrench, and a crowbar. Her fingers closed around it immediately. This was it, another step above, closer this time. Lena's breath hitched, no time. She threw herself against the locked door, wedging the crowbar into the frame, against the latch. The child whimpered behind the door. Lena shoved the panic in her throat down. She pushed. The wood groaned. Another step above. Creak. Lena clenched her jaw. She pushed harder. The door budged an inch, then another. The hinges rusted and creaked in protest. And then, crack. The door ripped open. Lena staggered back, just stopping herself from falling. The dog pushed forward, sniffing, searching, and then she saw a boy, curled up in the darkness, no more than 10 years old. His clothes were ragged, his arms skinny, his eyes bulging with fear. Lena's heart shattered. She reached for him. "It's okay," she whispered. "I'm getting you out." The boy recoiled but didn't pull away as she slipped an arm around his spindly shoulders. There sounded above them. The footsteps ceased. Lena froze. Then a whisper. Not from the child. Not from her. From above. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was low, hollow, cold. Lena's blood ran ice cold. The dog growled and moved protectively in front of her. Her mind raced. No more time. They had to get out. Now, Lena took the boy's hand and turned toward the stairs. The floor creaked again. There was breathing from above her. Lena's stomach twisted. They weren't being watched. They were being stalked. Whoever had remained up there had waited. Lena's grip on the boy's wrist tightened as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. They had seconds, maybe less. The air in the basement was oppressive, choking, and the knowledge that someone stood above them, alone, red ears, brought a wave of nausea to her belly. Her legs wanted to run, but she made herself breathe, think. The dog emitted a deep, rough growl, a threat. Lena pulled the boy closer. He was shaking, his tiny hands freezing cold. She bent down. "Can you walk?" she whispered. The boy nodded, just barely. Lena faced the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. She moved fast, too fast. The wooden steps creaked beneath her tread as she charged up, knuckles white around the railing. The boy's steps were unsteady, feeble, but he trailed. And then, a shadow moved above. Lena's breath hitched. She wasn't imagining it. Someone was at the trap door, a silhouette, broad shoulders, unmoving. And then, the creak of the trapdoor hinge. Whoever was up there was shutting it, locking them in. Lena's adrenaline surged. She barreled up the stairs and rammed her shoulder into the wooden hatch. The force jolted her bones, pain flaring in her arm. But the door, it hardly budged. Her pulse spiked. She hit it again, and again. The dog was barking frantically, smelling the seriousness, clawing up the stairs, body tense with fear. The boy whimpered, Lena's stomach twisted. She was too late. With one last, thunderous bang, the trapdoor was closed. The darkness consumed them whole. Lena's breathing was quick, uneven. Her hands flailed across the hard surface, searching for some latch, a means of escape, anything. But there was nothing. Whoever had locked them in, they had prepared for this. A chill ran down her spine. They weren't just trapped, they were being hunted. From the other side of the trap door, a gentle, slow knock. Once, twice, then a voice, calm, unnervingly calm. "You shouldn't have come here." Lena's blood turned to ice. She pressed her back against the wooden steps, heart thumping so hard she couldn't hear anything else. Its body pushed protectively into the boy, and the dog barked frantically. Lena lunged for the child, fingers trembling as she drew him close. "It's okay," she said, false and solitary. The footsteps circled overhead, slow, measured. A chair slid across the floor. They were sitting down, whoever they were. Waiting. Lena shut her eyes tight, trying to think. There must have been another way out. There must have been something they could do. Because if they didn't, they were never going to leave this basement alive. The air left Lena's chest fast, and her mind was an avalanche of thoughts. Trapped. The word reverberated in her skull like a death sentence. The air in the basement seemed denser now, more viscous, pressing down on her ribs. The boy gripped her arm, his tiny fingers pressing into her flesh. He was shaking, terrified. The dog faced them, his posture protective, his body coiled like a spring about to be released. His instincts were the same as Lena's. Whoever was upstairs wasn't going anywhere. A low creak came from above. Then another. Lena pressed herself into the basement wall, fingers closing together. The darkness hid him from her, but she felt his makeup-red face pressed up against her shoulder and the frantic rhythm of his breaths through his cracked voice. The voice came again, software mocking. "You don't belong here." The dog growled, his body shoving into Lena's leg, but she didn't even think of moving. She couldn't. Every fiber of her being was screaming to run, to fight, to do something. But there was nowhere to go. The only escape was up, via the person who had sealed them in. Another sound, a sharp, metallic click. Lena's stomach turned. A key. She heard the footsteps above change direction. Whoever was up there was not coming down. They were waiting, watching, toying with them. Her hands curled into fists. She wasn't going to let them sit here like caged animals. She had to move. She had to think. Lena's eyes flicked around the dim basement. The crates, the rusty pipes stretching along the walls. There had to be something that they could turn to. She turned toward the boy. "Hey, look at me." She was speaking in almost a whisper. "Is there another way out?" The boy hesitated. Then he nodded. Lena's pulse quickened. "Hope." She spoke in a low and controlled voice. "Where?" The boy raised a trembling hand and pointed to the back corner of the basement. Lena followed his gaze. A patch of bricks, loose, somewhat discolored. Her breath caught. An old coal chute, a way out. But it was small, barely wide enough for the boy to squeeze through, much less her. She faced the shut trapdoor again, straining to hear the slow, deliberate footsteps above them. She had seconds. Lena knelt before the boy and held his shoulders. "You're gonna crawl through that hole, all right? Fire the moment you hit the ground. You don't stop. You keep trying until you find someone. Understand?" The boy's eyes were wide, full of fear. But he nodded. A lump began to rise in Lena's throat. She had to be strong, for him. The dog nudged her leg, sensing the emergency. She had to act. Now. She seized one of the rusted pipes and pulled. The metal squealed and then it broke free. A weapon, a chance. She turned back to the boy. "Go." As he crawled toward the opening, he pushed through the opening by inching his small body through the space. All the while, the dog followed him. Lena looked back at the trap door. The footsteps had stopped. Silence. Then, the doorknob turned. Lena tightened her hold on the pipe. If they were going to take her, they were going to have to fight for it. Lena's knuckles were white as she gripped the rusted pipe tighter. The doorknob turned again, this time slower, deliberate. The child was still crawling through the gap. He was panting, breathy and fast, struggling to fling himself through the narrow coal chute. The dog was behind him and would push him with his snout, encouraging him to go faster. The boy wriggled free, is how Lena heard the bricks rearranging. Almost there. Then the trapdoor creaked open. A blast of cold air swept down the stairs. Lena's breath hitched. A shadow darkened above, sweeping down the stairs. A figure, tall, motionless, silent. Her heart thudded so loudly she feared it would betray her. A low, menacing growl came from the dog. He was stiff, ears back, tail held rigid. He was ready to fight. Lena summoned all her strength to hold her ground. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't leave the kid alone. The figure stepped down off the first step. Lena lifted the pipe. Another step. Then another. The figure stopped. Then a chuckle, software mocking. Goosebumps pricked her skin. The voice was calm, too calm. "You shouldn't have done like that." Lena's stomach twisted. She didn't hesitate. She swung the pipe. It connected, hard. The figure grunted, slumping back against the railing. Lena didn't stop. She couldn't. She tried again, swinging higher this time, but he was faster. A firm, frosty hand seized her wrist, pulling her forward. Lena managed a strangled gasp. The pipe fell from her grip, clanging on the floor. Her pulse spiked. The man's grip tightened. It was the first time she had seen his face, or what the shadows permitted. His eyes, cold, empty, a predator's eyes. "You're in my way," he said, almost laughing. Lena refused to break. She twisted, kicking him on the knee. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The grip loosened. Lena wrenched her arm away and reeled backward, seizing the first thing in reach, a splintered wooden plank from the floor. The man recovered fast. Too fast. Before he lunged, Lena hardly had time to respond. The dog barked, a violent, guttural noise. Then it happened fast. The dog leaped. His teeth dug into the man's arm. An agonized shriek pierced the basement. Lena didn't hesitate. She picked up the plank with both hands and swung with everything she had. The impact shoved the man backward. The dog held on. Blood seeped down the wooden steps. The man howled, whipping, trying to shake the dog loose. Lena moved. She didn't wait. She didn't think. She ran for the chute. At the last moment, the dog let go of the man and began to follow. Lena seized the edges of the chute and pulled herself up. A calloused hand reached out and grabbed her ankle. Lena screamed. She kicked, hard. The man cursed. His hold faltered. Lena fought forward, digging her way out from the dark. The dog was right behind her. And then, light, cold air, freedom. Lena fell onto the wet grass outside, panting. The boy stood next to her, pale-faced, wide-eyed with sheer terror. Lena turned, just in time to see the trapdoor slam shut. Silence. She looked at it, heart hammering. Had she really escaped? Or was that only the opening act? Lena sprawled on the cold, damp earth, her chest rising and falling in a ragged cadence. The boy stood frozen a few feet from her, staring at her, his face an inscrutable mix of fear and indecision. The dog went around both of them, his body stiff, ears laid back, still prepared to fight if need be. The trap door. Lena's eyes jerked to it, her mind flying. It had slammed shut. Had the man barricaded himself inside? Or was he coming back? The air was pressed against her skin, body vibrating, not only from fatigue, but from the horrifying truth of their escape. They had made it out, but they weren't safe, not yet. She willed herself to move, propping herself up onto her elbows and then onto her knees. The boy hadn't spoken, hadn't moved. He was paralyzed with fear. Lena reached for him. "We must leave," her voice hoarse. The boy paused, then nodded. Yes. She reached for his hand, her grip strong but tender. "Come on. We don't stop running until we're well removed from here." The dog kept tight, his low, deep growls buzzing in the still of the night. Lena dragged the boy along, the backs of her legs burning as they stumbled through the tangle of grass. Her brain still in a whirl. What just happened? Who was that man? Why had he imprisoned them in that basement? She didn't know much, but knew they needed to leave. As they traveled deeper into the woods, Lena kept glancing behind her, waiting for the man to emerge from the trapdoor chasing after them. But he didn't. The trapdoor remained closed. still. Too still. Her instincts told her something was wrong. The dog froze, his body stiff. His ears perked up and his nose rose to the wind. Lena's pulse spiked. She paused from walking, clutching the boy closer. The silence was unnatural. Then, a snap. A twig snapped somewhere behind them. Lena whipped around. Nothing. In the dark, she couldn't see anything. The trees surrounded her like guardians towering upwards towards the night sky. The dog responded with a low, rumbling growl, a warning. Lena's breath quickened. "Someone is following us," she said in a whisper. The boy squeezed her hand harder. She spun back around toward the path, walking faster now, her heart banging against her ribs. They heard footsteps, silenced but unmistakable, behind them. Lena's hold on the boy tightened. They weren't alone. Her mind whirled as it worked through their possibilities. If they continued to run, they would soon grow weary. They needed a plan. She scanned the dense forest, a hiding place, a weapon, anything. And then she spied it, an old wooden hunting blind half concealed by the trees. It was small, hardly large enough for all three of them, but it was shelter. Lena dragged the boy closer, blood racing in her ears. "In here," she whispered. The boy hesitated, then crawled inside. The dog trailed behind, ears twitching, nose still sniffing the air. Lena glanced back one last time before ducking inside, pressing her back against the jagged wooden walls. Silence. Her breathing was slow, her muscles taut. She listened. The footsteps had stopped. Whoever had been out there, they were waiting, watching. A chill ran down her spine. The dog growled low, not taking his eyes off the woods, and then a shadow moved, just beyond the trees. Lena's stomach twisted. They weren't safe yet. Lena's breath came in harsh gulps as she looked up at the trap door. It was over, at least for now. But her mind was racing, teetering between fear and survival. The boy was holding on to her leg, his tiny fingers curled around the sleeve of her jacket. The dog was alert, his chest heaving, his ears pinned back as he stared at the basement entrance. As the night air chilled Lena's sweat-dampened skin, she hardly noticed. Had they really escaped? Or was he just waiting, biding his time until he did it again? She concentrated on moving, on deluging through the fear settling on her like a weight. "We have to go." Her voice, hoarse and hardly more than a whisper. The boy nodded, glancing back and forth from her to the house, as if waiting for something, someone, to explode out of the trap door. Lena numbed at his hand and led him into the tree line. The dog trailed closely behind, his tail low, body taut. You have to get out before it's too late. They ran with their feet crunching against the wet forest floor. The darkness enveloped them, but Lena kept going. She couldn't. Her head spun with every step. Who was that man? Why did he have a child locked in his basement? And most of all, why had he let her go so easily? Something wasn't right. A prickle ran down her spine. The boy was slowing down. His breath was uneven. His tiny legs lagged, and he was so tired. Lena lowered in front of him, surrounding his face with her hands. "Not much farther, okay?" she whispered. "We're almost safe." The boy nodded weakly but trembled in his body. He was at his limit. Lena scanned the woods, looking for any sign of shelter. They couldn't stop here. Not while she could still sense the man in her mind, like some hunting animal prowling behind her eyes. She saw a group of trees in front of her, their roots intertwined and forming an alcove. It wasn't much, but that would have to suffice. "Come on," she said, picking the boy up into her arms. He was light, too light, but she didn't think about that. She dragged him into the trees and let him go, wrapping her arms around his tiny body to keep him warm. The dog lay down next to them, his body pressed protectively against the boy's legs. Lena took a deep breath, trying to settle her nerves. They were safe. For now. She, shouldering Bee, leaned back her head, letting it rest against the tree, trying to collect her thoughts. The boy, he was trapped in that basement for who knows how long. Did he even have a family? Did someone miss him? She ran her fingers through his matted hair while he slept, chest rising and falling erratically. Lena didn't sleep. She couldn't. Instead, she gazed into the darkness, waiting. Because something told her this wasn't finished. Lena trembled as she knelt on the cold, wet grass, her lungs searing with each labored inhalation. The boy shivered with the terrified breath of both their bodies. The dog, panting heavily, stood watch, his eyes on the trapdoor that had closed their nightmare behind them. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just silence. Thick, suffocating silence. The kind that made you unsure if the danger indeed had passed or was simply lying in wait before it struck again. Then suddenly, a sound, a deep, guttural creak. Lena sucked in her breath as the trapdoor rattled. The man was still there, still moving. There was a loud knock from below. Once, twice, then nothing. Lena was staring at the wooden hatch, her body tensed to spring. But the door remained closed. No footsteps, no threats, no scrambling to pry it open. She touched her fingers to her lips and then between the boy's eyes, his skin pale in the moonlight. He was holding onto the dog's fur as if the animal was his only anchoring in reality. "We have to go," Lena said, her voice a hoarse whisper over the roar of blood in her ears. The boy didn't argue. He nodded. Lena called out, dragging him to his feet, looking back only once at the trapdoor. The silence somehow made her uneasy. Why wasn't he making a break for it? Her gut twisted. They could not wait to see. She took the boy's hand and began to walk, the dog running alongside, his body still tense with alertness. Every shadow, every dart and rustle in the trees was eyes on them. They ran, over the tall, dew-soaked blades of grass, through skeletal branches reaching for them like ghost fingers, through the dark. Lena's legs burned, her lungs screamed, but she didn't stop. They needed to get as far away from that place as they could. When, finally, the trees thinned and the warm glow of distant streetlights flickered in the distance, she slowed, her chest heaving. The boy dropped to the ground next to her, holding his sides, panting. The dog nudged him, its body still curled protectively. Lena rubbed a trembling hand across her face, trying to think. They needed help. She fumbled in her pockets, her phone. Her fingers shook as she unlocked it, the screen brilliant in the dark. No service. Her stomach dropped. They needed to find someone. Fast. Then, a sound in the distance. Lena stiffened, the boy flinched. The dog's ears perked up. Footsteps. Not heavy, not rushed, but coming toward them. Lena spun toward the sound, her heart crashing against her ribs. A shadowed figure stepped into the light. Not the basement guy. This was someone else. A uniform, a flashlight, a police officer. Relief hit her so hard it almost took the wind from her lungs. She lurched forward, waving a trembling hand. "Help, please, we need help." The officer's flashlight swung in their direction, temporarily blinding her. Then, his voice, calm but urgent. What happened? Lena couldn't begin to explain. The boy gripped her arm harder. The dog stood firm. The woods lay behind them, dark and interminable. And somewhere, far above the trees beneath a trapdoor, a monster was still roaming. But for now, they were safe. For now.